Hi, from the lockdown bunker. Today I'd like to talk about spin doctors, people like Dominic Cummings, and especially about the way they operate. Donald Trump famously bats away damaging reports by calling them fake news. Recently, Downing Street chose the same tactic when, on the 22nd of May, The Guardian and Mirror published their investigation into the doings of Dominic Cummings. Number 10 did a Donald Trump. We will not waste our time answering a stream of false allegations about Mr. Cummings from campaigning newspapers, it said. In fact, most of the key allegations weren't false at all. And anyway, campaigning is what every self-respecting newspaper does and ought to do. Some of the fiercest questions at Dominic Cummings' extraordinary press conference in the Downing Street Rose Garden came from correspondents from the Daily Telegraph and the Daily Mail, papers which have both faithfully supported Boris Johnson. Most journalists have a characteristic determination to dig out the facts. It often enrages the Downing Street press machine, whichever party is in power, and most political journalists see themselves as being in hand-to-hand combat with the number 10 press people. In the early years of Margaret Thatcher's prime ministership, I was the BBC's political editor. Her press secretary, Bernard Ingham, had a pretty undisguised contempt for most of the lobby, as we political journalists were known. In those days, television coverage of Westminster was usually done from the safety of a studio, and I decided one night to do something pretty unprecedented. I stood outside number 10 to record a piece to camera. Ingham came roaring out. "I'm not having you use number 10 as a backdrop for your amateur theatricals," he yelled. But he couldn't stop me, of course. In those days, when the Thatcher government was just getting going, the press was the real opposition. Labour was preoccupied with one of its periodic civil wars, and the journalists from Tory papers mostly probed the Thatcher government just as effectively as the left of centre ones did, not just with the questions they asked, but with the articles they wrote afterwards. Nowadays, we hear a lot about Alistair Campbell, who was Tony Blair's spin doctor during the invasion of Iraq in 2003, and 4 years earlier, in 1999, during the NATO bombing campaign against Serbia. At that time, I was one of the very few Western journalists left in Belgrade, and when I reported that the NATO bombing was failing to win the war, Campbell started whispering in the ears of journalists at Westminster that I'd been nobbled by the Serbian government and was reporting what they told me to do. Tony Blair said much the same thing in Parliament. It wasn't true in the slightest, and most of the British press supported me. Campbell backed down. 4 years later, he famously went crazy when Downing Street's sexed-up dossier on Saddam Hussein's supposed weapons of mass destruction was questioned by the BBC. The shocking aftermath with the Hutton inquiry and the serious damage that did to the BBC helped to create the disenchantment with politics which has lasted right to this day. Whichever political party is in power, there's a strong family resemblance between spin doctors on the one hand and journalists on the other. The issues may be different, but the attitudes are the same. Dismissing investigative journalism as false allegations from campaigning newspapers, as Downing Street did about the Dominic Cummings story, is just the latest example. The weapon of choice is always the traditional one, the sledgehammer. But it doesn't seem to be working now. That's it from me. Until we meet again, goodbye.